The morning sun filtered through the window, casting soft light into the quiet room. Ethan sat hunched over an ancient spellbook, the complex symbols and cryptic incantations swirling in his mind like a never-ending puzzle. Despite Gabriel's guidance over the past few months, the depth of the material still left Ethan feeling overwhelmed. The room was silent, save for the soft rustle of wind brushing the curtains. Gabriel sat at the desk nearby, absorbed in a collection of ritual notes he had gathered from ancient texts over decades of ghost hunting experience. While the past weeks had been filled with research and preparation, their days often felt repetitive, spent poring over books and analyzing cases. Today seemed no different until the familiar ding of an email notification broke the silence. "There's another one?" Gabriel's voice came from across the room, his eyes fixed on the computer screen. His face remained calm, but there was a subtle intensity in his gaze, as if he had already discerned something important. Ethan put down his book and walked over to Gabriel's side, reading over his shoulder. The email was brief, almost rushed, written with an undertone of urgency. "I live in a small town, and for the past few months, my neighbors have been acting strangely. Each family member leaves the house at specific times of the day, always alone and always following the same routine. The mother leaves every morning at 5 a.m., carrying a heavy garbage bag that reeks of something foul. The father and daughter behave oddly, too, never appearing together and only going outside at set times. I'm starting to think something's very wrong. Can you please investigate?" The email ended without a signature, but the writer's anxiety was clear. Ethan frowned as he finished reading. "This sounds like a regular neighborhood dispute. People can have odd habits. Maybe the family just has strange routines." Gabriel's expression remained unchanged, his calm demeanor unshaken. A foul-smelling garbage bag and precise, isolated routines. This isn't just about strange habits. He tapped the screen lightly, his voice thoughtful. Repetitive behavior at fixed times often points to something ritualistic. It's a red flag when combined with the mention of decay or foul odors. Ethan raised an eyebrow, surprised by Gabriel's quick conclusion. "You think they're involved in some sort of ritual, like a curse or sacrifice?" Gabriel nodded, closing the book he'd been reading. "Yes, especially with the mention of the stench. A smell like that often indicates the presence of something dead or decaying. And in cases like this, it's frequently tied to an unfinished ritual." A familiar unease stirred within Ethan. Even though he had been on a few cases with Gabriel, the thought of encountering another supernatural event filled him with nervous anticipation. The memory of their last mission in the abandoned hospital still haunted him. The overwhelming presence of dark spirits, the suffocating weight of fear. "What do you think we're dealing with this time?" Ethan asked, trying to steady his voice. Gabriel walked over to the bookshelf and pulled out a tome on curses. Flipping through the pages, he answered, "It's hard to say for certain, but the stench of decay suggests the use of something organic, possibly animal parts or worse." Ethan winced at the thought, his stomach turning slightly. He couldn't help but imagine what might be inside that garbage bag. Something rotten, decomposing, or worse. "We need to check it out," Gabriel said, placing the book back on the shelf. "Whether it's supernatural or not, we can't ignore the possibility of something dangerous." The following morning, the first light of dawn painted the sky a soft gold. Dew clung to the grass, and the crisp morning air carried a hint of chill. Ethan and Gabriel set out early, heading towards the small town mentioned in the email. As their SUV drove away from the city, the scenery shifted from urban chaos to the calm of the countryside. Trees lined the road, their branches swaying gently in the breeze, while fields stretched endlessly under a light mist. Ethan stared out the passenger window, a mix of anticipation and unease bubbling in his chest. Though he had been working with Gabriel for some time, this mission felt different. The strange neighbors, the unsettling routines, and the rotting smell described in the email. It all weighed heavily on his mind. Worse still, he hadn't yet fully grasped how to deal with these supernatural forces. The air in the car was thick with tension. Gabriel, ever composed, focused on the road ahead, his sharp eyes missing nothing. He seemed to know exactly what lay in wait. What do you think we'll find this time? Ethan broke the silence, his voice carrying the nervous energy he tried to hide. Gabriel's hands remained steady on the wheel, his gaze locked on the road. He didn't answer right away, mulling over the possibilities. After a few moments, he spoke. Sometimes the clues seem harmless, even mundane, but they often hide something far more dangerous. We won't know for sure until we get there. Ethan nodded, though the vague answer didn't ease his nerves. His mind kept returning to the details in the email, the garbage bag, the family's robotic behavior. It didn't feel like a simple dispute between neighbors. You think they know they're being controlled? Ethan asked, his curiosity tinged with fear. They might not, Gabriel replied calmly. Sometimes people under a curse or dark influence carry out rituals without even realizing it. They can be completely unaware of what they're doing. A cold chill ran down Ethan's spine. He thought of the mother, routinely taking out the garbage at 5 a.m., perhaps unknowingly part of something dark, her actions dictated by forces beyond her control. After several hours of driving, they finally reached their destination. It was a sleepy town nestled deep in the countryside, the cobblestone streets lined with old brick houses, their exteriors weathered by time. The town seemed forgotten by the modern world, its aging buildings standing as silent witnesses to the passing years. A few elderly locals sat outside their homes, watching the newcomers with quiet suspicion. This place feels off, Ethan murmured as he looked around, his eyes scanning the quiet streets. Gabriel nodded. The most peaceful places often hide the darkest secrets. Stay alert. Don't miss any details. They parked in front of a small, aging inn. The sign above the door was faded, the wooden frame cracked and splintered. As they entered, they were greeted by the innkeeper, a wrinkled old man with watchful eyes and a reserved demeanor. How long will you be staying? The man's voice was raspy, almost reluctant, as though he preferred them not to stay too long. A few days, depending on how things go, Gabriel answered, his tone polite but direct. He studied the innkeeper's reaction closely, noting the slight flicker of unease in the man's expression. The innkeeper hesitated before handing over the keys. Well, I hope you find what you're looking for, he said cryptically, as if knowing more than he let on. As Ethan followed Gabriel up to their room, the sense of unease lingered. Something about this town felt wrong. The locals seemed too quiet, their eyes too wary. It was as if they were all guarding a secret they dared not reveal. Once inside their room, they began setting up for the investigation. The room itself was as old as the inn, barely furnished, with peeling wallpaper and a musty smell hanging in the air. But from the window, they had a clear view of the apartment building where the strange neighbors lived. Tomorrow we'll start observing them, Gabriel said as he peered out the window, his eyes locking onto the building across the street. Ethan joined him, staring at the building. The windows were tightly shut, and there was no sign of life inside. The whole place seemed eerily still, like a house frozen in time. A chill ran through Ethan. He couldn't shake the image of the woman with the garbage bag or the lingering stench. Whatever was going on inside that building, it was anything but normal. Do you think they know we're watching them? Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Gabriel didn't turn away from the window. Maybe, but that's not what matters. What matters is what they're hiding. Ethan took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. He knew that the investigation ahead would likely reveal dark and terrifying truths, and he needed to be ready. As night fell, the town grew even quieter, the streets bathed in the pale light of the moon. Lying in bed, Ethan found sleep elusive. His mind replayed the image of the mother with the garbage bag, the imagined stench filling his nostrils, making him uneasy. He knew something was wrong in that house, something they were about to uncover. The dawn light was just beginning to creep over the horizon, casting long shadows across the empty streets. The town still slept under a blanket of eerie silence, the air crisp with the coolness of early morning. Ethan stood by the inn window, watching the building across the street with keen eyes, waiting for any sign of movement. Gabriel sat at a small table in the room, sipping from a steaming cup of coffee, his gaze never straying far from the window. The room was filled with tension, the kind that comes before something significant is about to happen. The day was only just beginning, but their work was already in motion. "She's coming out now," Gabriel said quietly, breaking the stillness. His eyes sharpened as he focused on the figure stepping out of the apartment building. Ethan immediately raised his binoculars, zeroing in on the familiar figure of the neighbor's mother. Just as described in the email, it was 5 a.m. on the dot. The woman wore a heavy gray coat and a large black mask that covered most of her face, concealing her features. In her hand was the garbage bag, bulging, its dark, shiny surface catching the faint light of the early morning. Even from across the street, Ethan could almost smell it, the sickening, rotten stench the email had warned about. He swallowed hard, trying to push down the nausea that rose in his throat. "That smell is even worse than I imagined," Ethan muttered, trying to keep his voice steady. He kept the binoculars trained on the woman as she moved down the steps of the apartment building. The woman's movements were quick, almost frantic, her head darting from side to side as if checking to make sure no one was watching. She clutched the garbage bag tightly, as if its contents were precious or dangerous. Her walk was brisk, her steps hurried, as though she was trying to get the task over with as soon as possible. She reached the large dumpster beside the building and tossed the bag inside, the heavy thud of it hitting the bottom louder than expected. Then, just as swiftly, she turned on her heel and headed back into the apartment, her body language still rigid, her motions mechanical. Ethan lowered the binoculars and glanced at Gabriel. That didn't seem normal. She looked like she was following orders, like she had no choice. Gabriel nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's more than just strange behavior. It's too controlled, too routine. Something or someone is making sure they stick to the schedule." Ethan couldn't shake the image of the woman's rapid, nervous movements. "So, they're acting like they don't have any free will?" "Exactly," Gabriel confirmed, his voice calm yet focused. "It's the hallmark of possession or influence. They might not even realize they're being controlled." Ethan glanced out the window again. "And that bag? What could be inside to smell so bad?" "It's more than just garbage." Gabriel looked back at the window, his voice lowering. "Rotting organic matter, most likely. Sacrificial remains. Whatever it is, it's feeding something dark." Ethan's stomach turned at the thought, his imagination running wild. He had heard stories of rituals involving decayed animal parts or, worse, human remains. The possibility that they were dealing with something so gruesome gnawed at him, but he forced himself to stay focused. As the day wore on, their surveillance continued. Just as the email had predicted, the family's daughter left the apartment around noon. She couldn't have been older than 6, her small frame dwarfed by an oversized coat and her hair tied up in a loose ponytail. Her expression was blank, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she had no sense of her surroundings. Ethan watched her closely through the binoculars, his mind racing. The little girl walked around the street aimlessly for about 10 minutes, never going far, never looking up. She seemed to be fulfilling some strange, unexplained task. Then, just as silently, she returned to the apartment building. "They never leave together, always at different times," Ethan said aloud, noting the eerie precision in their behavior. "It's like they're following a script." Gabriel leaned back slightly in his chair, his face tense with concentration. "It's deliberate. If they're being controlled by something, it's keeping them apart, isolated. That's typical in cases of ritualistic influence." As evening fell, the pattern continued. At exactly 8 p.m., the father emerged, his face blank and lifeless, carrying a small, worn duffel bag. His steps were slow, his body language heavy with fatigue, as if each movement required immense effort. Ethan tracked his every step, noting the eerie similarity to the mother and daughter's routines. Each family member moved like a puppet on strings, their actions devoid of life or individuality. "They're like puppets," Ethan muttered, almost to himself. "Each of them is acting on their own, at specific times, with no sense of purpose. They're more than just acting," Gabriel added, his voice dark with understanding. "They're being manipulated, likely by the force we're dealing with." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. The thought of an unseen entity pulling the strings, forcing this family to act out these bizarre routines, made the situation even more disturbing. They had watched the family for a full day, and everything they saw pointed to one conclusion. This was no ordinary curse or haunting. Something far darker was at work. "We need to go inside," Gabriel said after a long silence. His voice was firm, but there was a hint of concern. "The only way to truly understand what's happening is to see it up close." Ethan's pulse quickened. The idea of stepping into the house, into the heart of whatever was controlling this family, filled him with dread. But there was no turning back now. Night fell over the small town, the darkness settling like a thick, suffocating blanket. The streets were empty, save for the occasional flicker of light from a distant street lamp. Gabriel and Ethan stood in front of the apartment building, the oppressive silence around them amplifying every sound. Ethan's heart raced as he gripped the protective charms Gabriel had given him earlier. He had never felt this tense before a mission, but something about this case felt different, more dangerous. Gabriel knelt in front of the apartment door, working quietly with his lock-picking tools. In a matter of seconds, the lock clicked open with a soft snap. The door creaked as it swung inward, revealing the dark interior. Immediately, the smell hit them, stronger than before, a foul stench of decay that made Ethan's stomach churn. "Stay close, and don't make any sudden movements," Gabriel whispered as he stepped inside, his flashlight cutting through the thick darkness. Ethan followed, trying to control his breathing, his senses on high alert. The interior of the apartment was far colder than the night air outside. The chill cut straight to the bone, and the overwhelming sense of wrongness was palpable. Shadows seemed to linger in every corner, shifting as the beam of the flashlight passed over them. The walls were adorned with old family photos, but the faces were blurred, the features smeared and distorted, as though time itself had erased them. They walked through the living room, where the furniture was neatly arranged, yet covered in a fine layer of dust, as if no one had truly lived there for months. The silence in the house was stifling, broken only by the soft creaking of the floorboards beneath their feet. "This place feels like a tomb," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. "In many ways, it is," Gabriel responded, his tone steady but tense. "What you're seeing is just a facade. This house has been consumed by whatever dark force is controlling them." They moved deeper into the apartment, finally reaching a door at the end of the hall. The door was different from the others, more worn and scarred, with cracks along the frame as if it had been forced open before. A foul odor leaked through the small gap at the bottom of the door, stronger than anywhere else in the house. "This is where we need to be," Gabriel said quietly, his voice filled with certainty. He pushed the door open with a creak, and a wave of cold, damp air hit them. The room beyond was pitch black, save for the thin beam of Gabriel's flashlight. As the light swept across the room, it revealed a small table in the center, covered with blackened candles and torn pieces of ritual paper. Symbols had been scratched into the wood, chaotic and unsettling. "An altar," Gabriel murmured, his eyes narrowing. "They've been performing rituals here." Repeatedly, Ethan approached the table, his flashlight illuminating a stack of old, yellowed photographs. The photos were of the family, mother, father, and daughter, but their faces were contorted, twisted into expressions of agony and fear. "These people," Ethan muttered, a shiver running down his spine. They were aware of what was happening to them, at least at some point. Gabriel examined the ritual symbols more closely. They were, but not anymore. Whatever control they had over their actions is long gone. Night had fully descended over the small town, the oppressive darkness swallowing the narrow streets. The cold wind whistled through the alleys, carrying with it a sharp chill that cut through the silence like a blade. Ethan and Gabriel stood before the neighbor's house, both of them acutely aware that crossing this threshold meant they were stepping into something far darker than they had initially anticipated. Gabriel deftly unlocked the door with practiced ease, the faint click of the lock barely audible. As the door creaked open, a wave of cold, stale air greeted them, heavy with the unmistakable stench of decay. "Let's go," Gabriel whispered, signaling Ethan to follow. The moment Ethan stepped inside, an overwhelming sense of dread washed over him. The air inside the house was damp, clinging to his skin like a thick fog. He fought back the nausea rising in his throat, the foul odor almost unbearable now. It wasn't just the smell. It was the sensation of something sinister lurking in every corner, watching them, waiting. Gabriel moved cautiously, his flashlight casting eerie shadows across the dusty floor. The living room was surprisingly clean, with furniture neatly arranged and untouched by time. But there was something unnerving about it all. It was too perfect, too still, like a museum exhibit frozen in time. "This doesn't feel right," Ethan muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "It's too clean." Gabriel nodded but didn't stop. "It's all a front. This house is masking the darkness underneath." As they moved deeper into the house, the temperature seemed to drop even further. Their breath hung in the air like mist, and every creak of the floorboards echoed ominously. Family photos hung on the walls, but the faces were blurred, smeared with age and time. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the eyes in the photos followed him as they walked by. The house had an unsettling atmosphere, as if time itself had warped around it. Dust coated every surface, but there was no sign of life. No clutter, no personal items, just an eerie stillness. They reached a door at the end of the hallway. It looked different from the others, worn and battered, as though it had been forced open many times before. Ethan hesitated, feeling a surge of unease. Gabriel placed a hand on the doorknob and turned it slowly. The door creaked open, revealing a dark room filled with the same suffocating stench that had been following them since they entered the house. Inside the room, the stench was overwhelming. Gabriel's flashlight illuminated the source. A small table in the center of the room, covered with blackened, half-melted candles and torn scraps of ritual paper. Symbols had been scratched into the walls and floor, crude markings that sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. "This is where it's happening," Gabriel said in a low voice, stepping closer to the table. "They've been performing rituals here, over and over." Ethan approached cautiously, the beam of his flashlight landing on a pile of old, faded photographs scattered across the table. The photos depicted the family, mother, father, and daughter, but their faces were twisted into grotesque expressions of pain and fear. It was as if the photos had captured their descent into madness. "These people, they knew what they were doing," Ethan said, his voice shaky. "They were aware of it, at least at some point." Gabriel studied the symbols on the wall. But they've lost control. Whatever power they were trying to summon has taken over completely. The oppressive weight of the room seemed to press down on them, the air thick with malevolence. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, and his fingers tightened around the protective charm Gabriel had given him. Without warning, the temperature in the room plummeted. Ethan could see his breath fogging in the cold air, and a low, guttural whisper seemed to echo from the shadows. The darkness in the corners of the room seemed to shift and pulse, as though something was moving within it. "It's here," Gabriel said quietly, his hand reaching into his bag for the protective amulets. Ethan's body tensed. He felt it too, a presence, unseen but powerful, lurking in the dark. The shadows on the wall began to writhe, and the whispering grew louder, though the words were indecipherable. Ethan's pulse raced, his mouth going dry. Then, from the corner of the room, a figure slowly emerged. A woman. Her pale, ghostly face was barely visible in the dim light, her wet hair hanging limply over her shoulders. She wore an old, tattered dress, and her eyes were empty, dark voids that seemed to pull at Ethan's very soul. "Don't look into her eyes," Gabriel ordered sharply, pulling a protective charm from his bag and holding it in front of him. Ethan tore his gaze away just as the figure began to move toward him. Her movements were slow, but there was something unnatural about the way she floated inches above the ground, her feet never touching the floor. Her body seemed to shimmer in and out of focus, as though she wasn't entirely of this world. Before Ethan could react, the woman let out a piercing, otherworldly scream. The force of it hit him like a physical blow, sending him stumbling backward. The room seemed to vibrate with the intensity of the scream, the walls groaning under the weight of the noise. The spirit lunged toward Ethan, her hands outstretched, her face contorted with rage. He barely had time to raise the protective charm Gabriel had given him. The charm glowed faintly, and as the spirit's hands came into contact with it, she let out a howl of pain, recoiling as if burned. "Use the charm," Gabriel shouted, taking a step forward to shield Ethan. "It's the only thing that will keep her at bay." Ethan tightened his grip on the charm and held it out in front of him, forcing himself to stand his ground despite the terror coursing through him. The spirit's form flickered, her face twisting with fury as she struggled to push past the charm's protective barrier. For a moment, it seemed like the spirit would break through, her hand reaching out toward Ethan's throat. But then, with one final, agonized shriek, she dissolved into a cloud of dark mist, vanishing into the shadows. The room was silent again, save for Ethan's labored breathing. The temperature slowly returned to normal, and the suffocating pressure lifted. Ethan collapsed against the wall, his entire body shaking with adrenaline. He could still feel the cold touch of the spirit's presence lingering on his skin. Gabriel walked over, his expression calm but his eyes sharp. "You did well. You held your ground." Ethan nodded, trying to steady his breath. Is she gone?" "Temporarily," Gabriel replied, glancing at the altar. "She was only the beginning. We need to find the source of her power, the object or ritual binding her to this place." Ethan forced himself to his feet, still shaken but determined. "What now?" Gabriel looked around the room, his gaze settling on the symbols carved into the walls. "We keep searching. The core of her power is hidden somewhere in this house." The immediate danger seemed to pass, but the house remained oppressive, as though the darkness clung to the very walls. The stench of decay still lingered, though it was less overpowering than before. The spirit was gone for now, but Ethan knew it was only a matter of time before it returned. They needed answers, and they needed them fast. Ethan and Gabriel stood in the center of the room, surveying the remnants of the rituals that had been performed there. Scraps of burned paper and melted wax littered the floor, along with dried herbs and other remnants of dark magic. Gabriel knelt down, inspecting the floor closely. The rituals they were conducting here, they weren't trying to summon the spirit. They were trying to control it. Ethan looked confused. But they failed, right? That thing was anything but under control. Gabriel nodded grimly. They failed, yes. But their attempts only strengthened the spirit's hold on this place. Each failed ritual made it more powerful. Ethan turned his attention to a corner of the room, where a small, dusty book lay partially hidden beneath a pile of old photographs. He picked it up, brushing off the dust to reveal its cracked, leather cover. Inside, the pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with handwritten notes and strange symbols. "I found something," Ethan said, flipping through the pages. "It looks like an old spell book or a journal." Gabriel joined him, taking the book and studying it closely. The writing was chaotic, almost frantic, but it was clear enough to make out a few key phrases. Ethan watched as Gabriel's eyes narrowed, his expression growing more serious. "This is it," Gabriel said finally. "This book holds the key. They were trying to bind the spirit to this house, but instead, they unleashed it." Ethan looked over Gabriel's shoulder, reading the words scrawled on the page. It was a ritual designed to keep an evil presence trapped within the walls of a house, using sacrifices to weaken it over time. But instead of weakening the spirit, the ritual had only empowered it, allowing it to take control of the family. They were feeding it, Ethan realized with a sickening sense of dread. That's what the garbage bags were for, the sacrifices. The more they gave it, the stronger it became. Gabriel closed the book and handed it back to Ethan. "We need to destroy whatever is binding the spirit here. The source of its power is still in this house, and we need to find it." Ethan nodded, his resolve hardening. "Let's do it. Whatever it takes." Gabriel motioned toward the door. "We'll start with the storage room. It's the only place we haven't checked yet, and it's likely where they kept the most dangerous objects." Ethan followed Gabriel down the narrow hallway, their footsteps echoing through the empty house. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of shadow, seemed to whisper that they were not alone. The spirit was watching, waiting for them to make a mistake. They reached a small door near the back of the house, hidden behind a stack of old boxes. The door was covered in dust, the handle cold to the touch. Gabriel pushed it open with a soft creak, revealing a cramped storage room filled with old furniture, boxes, and forgotten relics of the past. But there, in the center of the room, stood something that immediately drew their attention. A small wooden box, covered in strange symbols, resting on an old wooden shelf. The symbols matched the ones they had seen in the ritual room. "This is it," Gabriel said softly, stepping closer to the box. "The source of the curse." Ethan felt a surge of unease as he stared at the box. Even from across the room, he could sense the dark energy radiating from it. His instinct screamed at him to stay away, but he knew they had no choice. "We need to destroy it," Gabriel said, reaching into his bag for the tools they would need to break the curse. Ethan's heart raced as they prepared for the final confrontation, knowing that whatever power had been keeping the spirit tethered to the house was about to be unleashed. The small storage room felt even more oppressive now that Ethan and Gabriel had uncovered the source of the evil. The wooden box, covered in strange symbols that pulsed with dark energy. The air seemed thicker, colder, as though the room itself was alive with the spirit's rage. Ethan could feel the tension in his muscles, his pulse quickening as Gabriel carefully set the tools down on the dusty floor. "This is it," Gabriel said quietly. "This box contains the spirit's tether to this house. If we destroy it, the curse will break." Ethan nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling of dread creeping up his spine. Destroying the box sounded simple, but he knew that nothing about this was going to be easy. Gabriel laid out the protective charms, salt, and a small vial of holy water. He also pulled out a special dagger etched with runes, one designed for breaking curses. Ethan had seen it used before, but this time felt different. This time, the enemy was more powerful than anything they had faced together. "Are you ready?" Gabriel asked, his voice steady but his eyes sharp with focus. Ethan swallowed hard and nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be." Gabriel began by encircling the box with salt, creating a protective barrier. He then handed Ethan a charm to hold, its warm surface offering a small but reassuring comfort in the face of the looming confrontation. Together, they knelt in front of the box. Gabriel muttered a prayer under his breath before he began the ritual. With the dagger in hand, he carefully traced the symbols on the box, chanting in a low, rhythmic voice. Ethan watched, tense and alert, as the energy in the room seemed to shift, growing heavier with each passing second. Suddenly, the air in the room turned icy. The shadows on the walls began to writhe, twisting into grotesque shapes. The temperature plummeted, and Ethan could see his breath in the cold, dark air. A low, guttural growl echoed through the room, sending a chill down Ethan's spine. "It's here," Gabriel warned, tightening his grip on the dagger. Ethan's eyes darted around the room as the shadows coalesced into a familiar, horrifying shape, the spirit of the woman they had encountered earlier. But this time, she was more corporeal, her figure more defined, her eyes glowing with hatred and rage. She let out an ear-piercing scream, the force of it rattling the boxes and shelves around them. The spirit lunged forward, her skeletal hands reaching out, her face twisted in fury. Ethan instinctively held up the charm Gabriel had given him, the protective energy from it glowing faintly in the dark. But the spirit was stronger now, more determined. She clawed at the charm, her fingers barely grazing Ethan's hand as she tried to break through. "Focus!" Gabriel shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Keep the charm up. She can't get to you if you hold steady." Ethan gritted his teeth, feeling the force of the spirit's rage as she pressed closer. His hand shook, but he held the charm steady, the light growing brighter as Gabriel continued the ritual. The spirit hissed in anger, recoiling from the glow. But just as they thought they had the upper hand, the spirit let out another shriek and hurled herself at the protective salt circle, scattering it with a violent sweep of her hand. The moment the salt circle was broken, the spirit's power surged. She roared in triumph and lashed out at Gabriel, who barely had time to dodge her attack. Her form twisted and warped, a blur of movement as she circled them like a predator hunting its prey. Gabriel didn't falter. He grabbed a handful of salt and threw it toward the spirit, creating a temporary barrier that slowed her down. But they both knew they couldn't keep her at bay for long. "We have to destroy the box now," Gabriel shouted, his voice filled with urgency. Ethan, still holding the charm, struggled to stay focused as the spirit's presence became more intense, more aggressive. Gabriel quickly slashed the box with the dagger, chanting louder as he worked to break the final seal. The spirit howled in fury, her form flickering in and out of existence as Gabriel's words grew more powerful. She lunged again, but this time, she couldn't get past the growing energy that surrounded the box. Finally, with a swift and decisive strike, Gabriel drove the dagger into the center of the box. The room seemed to explode with light and sound, the force of it knocking Ethan backward. The spirit let out a final, anguished scream as her form disintegrated into a cloud of dark mist, dissolving into nothingness. For a moment, everything was still. The oppressive darkness lifted, the air felt lighter, and the stench of decay faded. The curse had been broken. Ethan slowly pushed himself up, his head spinning from the intensity of the fight. He looked over at Gabriel, who was standing calmly, his breath steady but his expression serious. "It's done," Gabriel said, sheathing the dagger. Ethan let out a shaky breath, feeling the weight of the moment sink in. They had won, but the battle had been harder than he had imagined. With the curse broken, Ethan and Gabriel returned to the main room of the house. The family members, mother, father, and daughter, were lying unconscious on the floor, but they were beginning to stir. The first to awaken was the mother. Her eyes fluttered open, and she sat up slowly, looking around in confusion. What happened?" "You're safe now," Gabriel said gently, kneeling beside her. "The spirit is gone. The curse is broken." The mother blinked, trying to comprehend his words. I don't remember. We were all..." And then my daughter, her voice cracked, tears welling up in her eyes as she reached for her child. The father and daughter also began to awaken, their faces pale and drawn, but their expressions were no longer vacant. They looked around, dazed but relieved. Gabriel spoke softly to them, explaining the curse and the spirit that had taken control of their lives. They listened in stunned silence, the weight of his words sinking in as they realized the horror they had been living under. When the family finally understood what had happened, the mother broke down in tears, clutching her daughter to her chest. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for saving us." Gabriel offered a small, comforting smile. "You don't need to thank us. Just focus on healing and moving forward." Ethan watched the scene unfold, a bittersweet feeling settling in his chest. He was relieved they had broken the curse, but the emotional toll it had taken on the family was clear. They had been through a nightmare, one they would never fully escape. As they left the house, the sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. The small town was quiet, the streets empty, and for the first time since they had arrived, Ethan felt like he could breathe again. Gabriel packed up the tools they had used, his movements methodical and calm. Ethan, still feeling the adrenaline coursing through his veins, glanced back at the house one last time. "It's over," he said quietly, more to himself than to Gabriel. Gabriel nodded, slinging his bag over his shoulder. "For them, yes, but there will always be more." Ethan didn't respond, but he knew Gabriel was right. This was just one of many battles they would face, and the darkness that haunted the world wasn't something that could ever be fully defeated. The early morning sun cast a soft, golden light over the town as Ethan and Gabriel returned to the small inn where they had been staying. The air was crisp and fresh, the lingering weight of the night's battle slowly fading as they prepared to rest before their next mission. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, staring out the window at the peaceful scene below. It was hard to believe that just hours ago, they had been fighting for their lives against a malevolent spirit. Now, Everything seemed so calm, so normal. As the first light of dawn crept through the window, Ethan sat quietly, lost in thought. The mission was over, the family saved, but the weight of what they had seen lingered in his mind. He thought about how much had changed since he first met Gabriel, how different his life had become since those early days of doubt and disbelief. Gabriel's calm voice broke through his thoughts. "There's always another case, but for now we rest." Ethan nodded, feeling the exhaustion settle in. He knew the darkness was never truly gone, but for now they could take a moment to breathe. Gabriel stood at the window, looking out at the quiet street below. "I have a feeling something else will come up soon," he said thoughtfully, his tone steady. "There's always more to do." Ethan looked up, catching Gabriel's glance. "I'm ready whenever you are." They packed their gear, stepping out into the fresh morning air, knowing the road ahead was far from over. Thank you for watching. We hope you enjoyed this episode of The Apprentice and the Hunter, Dark Forces Unleashed. If you're as intrigued by the supernatural as we are, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. If you had a mysterious neighbor who acted strangely at specific times, would you try to investigate or stay far away? Let us know how you would handle a spooky situation like this. We can't wait to read your responses. Your stories and ideas make this community even better.